What happens when a firefighter risking everything to save lives gets mistaken for a criminal? The truth that comes out next will leave you speechless. The Los Angeles sky looked like a scene straight out of an apocalypse. Fiery red hues reflected off thick clouds of smoke that rolled across the streets, swallowing everything in their path. The Paradise Hills neighborhood, once known for its tight-knit community, had turned into a war zone. Families scrambled to pack whatever they could grab: photo albums, pets, essentials. Panic clung to the air as tightly as the ash. Amid the chaos, a man named Marcus Turner stood out, tall and broad-shouldered. Marcus was a black man wearing a plain t-shirt and worn jeans. He wasn't running away from the flames like everyone else. He was driving toward them. His beat-up pickup truck was packed with wide-eyed, terrified children. No superhero cape, no camera crews, just a man doing what had to be done. Marcus was a volunteer, a quiet force of nature who didn't need recognition. He'd spent the entire day weaving through smoke-clogged streets, pulling families from the brink of disaster. His truck wasn't just transportation, it was a lifeline. Kids clung to each other in the back, soot smudging their faces. They didn't know him, but they trusted him. That look in Marcus's eyes, a mix of unshakable calm and determination, was enough to steady even the most frantic parent. As he navigated another narrow street, his headlights caught a woman standing in front of a burning house. She clutched a toddler to her chest, her face a portrait of sheer desperation. Without hesitation, Marcus hit the brakes. The truck groaned as he jumped out. "Ma'am, come with me. I've got space in the truck," he shouted over the roar of the fire. The woman didn't move at first, her feet glued to the pavement as though she couldn't believe someone had shown up. But when Marcus reached her and gently took the child, her instincts kicked in. Together, they sprinted back to the truck, flames licking dangerously close. Marcus lifted the toddler into the truck bed and then helped the woman climb in. Their eyes met for a brief second, hers filled with gratitude and disbelief, his calm and unwavering. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. But the universe wasn't about to let Marcus have a moment of triumph. Not here. Not now. As he turned onto a main road, relief creeping into his chest. It happened. Bright red and blue lights. A siren that could have been mistaken for a scream. 2 squad cars blocked the intersection ahead, and out stepped 2 white officers. The way their hands hovered near their holsters, you'd think they were facing an armed felon. "Step out of the vehicle. Now," one of them barked, his flashlight blinding as it landed squarely on Marcus's face. The children in the truck burst into tears, their panic piercing through the heavy night air. Marcus froze, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. Then, slowly and deliberately, he raised them. "I'm evacuating kids," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "The fire is right behind us." If they heard him, they didn't show it. Instead, they moved in like predators closing in on prey. One officer yanked Marcus out of the driver's seat, slamming him against the side of the truck. The other began rifling through the vehicle, ignoring the sobbing kids and the panicked woman. "Put your hands behind your back," the officer growled, his grip like a vice. Marcus complied, his jaw tightening. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. The woman in the truck leaned out, clutching the side. "What are you doing? He saved us. He's helping these kids," she shouted. "Step back." "Ma'am," the second officer snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. "We'll handle this." Marcus wanted to laugh. No, not laugh, scoff. Of course. He couldn't just be a guy helping kids. To them, he had to be a suspect. His truck full of terrified children wasn't a sign of heroism. It was suspicious activity. He turned his head slightly, his voice laced with controlled disbelief. "You seriously think I'm kidnapping a truckload of kids in the middle of a wildfire? Are you hearing yourself right now?" The officer didn't answer. He was too busy checking the plates on the truck, mumbling something into his radio. Meanwhile, the other officer kept his hand on Marcus's back as if he were about to bolt. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. "Officer," Marcus tried again, his voice firmer. "There's a house 5 blocks back that's already gone up in flames. We don't have time for this." The cop snorted, clearly unimpressed. We'll decide what's important. You just stay quiet." The kids' cries grew louder. The woman was now openly pleading with the officers, her voice cracking under the strain. Marcus stood there, his hands cuffed behind his back, feeling the weight of every wrong assumption these men were making. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who's ever been stopped for simply existing. And it wasn't going to stop the fire. What happened next changed everything. As Marcus's wrists were wrenched behind his back, the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his skin. He barely flinched as one officer shoved him face first onto the dusty hood of the truck. Sweat mixed with soot ran down his face, his t-shirt clinging to his back, damp and stained. The fire roared in the distance, consuming houses and hopes alike. And yet here he was, being treated like the criminal of the year. The children in the truck cried louder, their small voices trembling with fear. But the officers didn't seem to hear them, or they simply didn't care. "It's just kids," the woman Marcus had rescued earlier shouted, stepping forward. "He's saving us. Leave him alone." Her voice cracked with desperation, but one of the officers turned to her with nothing but disdain. "Ma'am, step back," he barked, his tone as sharp as the shove he gave her. "We'll handle this." Handle this? Marcus wanted to laugh. What exactly were they handling? Certainly not the blazing inferno creeping closer with every second. He didn't say anything, though. He just lay there, his cheek pressed against the hot metal, staring into the flames and wondering how on earth this was happening. "Suspected vehicle theft," one officer announced, popping open the truck's glove compartment like he'd just cracked a safe. "Or maybe an attempted kidnapping. What are you really up to?" "Huh." Marcus turned his head slightly, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "It's my truck, and it's not kidnapping. Those kids needed help, so I helped." His words didn't land. They never did in situations like this. The officers barely glanced at him before whispering something to each other, their faces unreadable. One of them pulled out a radio and began mumbling into it. To Marcus, it might as well have been a foreign language. The woman behind him wasn't giving up. She planted herself by the truck, her arms spread wide like she could somehow shield the kids from all this madness. "Look at them," she shouted, her voice rising. "They're scared out of their minds. And you're making it worse. This man saved us." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. One officer waved her off while the other continued his investigation. They opened the truck bed, rummaged through Marcus's supplies, even checked under the seats. What did they think they'd find? A blueprint for world domination? Marcus, still pinned against the hood, let out a heavy breath. "Officer, there's a fire swallowing this neighborhood as we speak," he said, his tone steady but pointed. "Maybe focus on that." The officer closest to him snorted. "We'll focus on whatever we decide is important." There it was again, that maddening dismissal, like he was nothing but an inconvenience in their otherwise perfect day. Marcus felt a pang of frustration, but more than that, he felt tired. Tired of explaining himself, tired of being doubted, tired of the never-ending assumption that he had to be up to no good because of how he looked. As if the universe decided to throw him a bone. A second police vehicle rolled up. Out stepped a Latina officer, her dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes swept the scene. Marcus cuffed, the crying kids, the frantic woman, and her jaw tightened. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We're investigating a suspect," one officer replied, his tone casual. Too casual. "Truck's not registered, and he's got a load of kids in the back." "Excuse me," Marcus said loudly, his patience running thin. "My documents are in my pocket. If you'll let me, I can show them to you." The Latina officer's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and gestured for the officer to retrieve the papers. He hesitated but eventually obeyed, fishing out Marcus's wallet and handing it to her. She opened it, pulling out his ID and vehicle registration. Her eyes scanned the documents, her brows furrowing slightly before she glanced back at him. "Do you have any idea who you just detained?" she said, her voice low but firm. The two officers froze, their postures stiffening. The air around them seemed to shift as the Latina officer turned to them, her gaze now razor-sharp. "This man," she said, holding up the ID for emphasis, "is your hero?" Her words hit like a gut punch. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence visibly shaken. The Latina officer crossed her arms and stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she addressed her colleagues. "Maybe you've forgotten," she said, her tone sharp, "but heroes don't all look the same. And today, this man saved more lives than you ever will." The children in the truck started clapping. It wasn't coordinated or anything. It was raw, spontaneous. Their little hands slapped together, their tears drying as their fear turned into something closer to awe. The woman Marcus had saved smiled through her tears and stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "You're a good man," she whispered. "Thank you." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped back toward the truck, his movements deliberate and calm. He climbed into the driver's seat without looking back, adjusting the mirror so he could see the kids in the back. They were smiling now, some of them even laughing, as if the storm had finally passed. As he started the engine, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. The officers were still standing there, rooted to the spot, their expressions blank. It was like they'd been frozen in time, unable to process what had just happened. The truck rumbled to life, and Marcus drove off, the flames still visible in the distance, but no longer the biggest fire he'd faced that night. In the rearview mirror, the officers grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than specks on the horizon. Specks of a system he'd learned to navigate but never stopped fighting against. And as the truck disappeared around the corner, Marcus's focus was already on the road ahead. There were still lives to save,